Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. The interest in AI and its governance is very intense at the moment, and just this morning the government has set out, or is about to publish, a white paper setting out its proposed approach to the governance of AI. The white paper invites responses before it's confirmed, and the committee will be feeding into that as well. But perhaps I might ask both of our witnesses just to comment on, I guess, what's the headline indication from the white paper, which is that rather than giving responsibility for AI governance to a single new AI regulator, the government intends to empower existing regulators. And obviously there are several that exist in the education sector. Do you have any initial reaction to that, Professor Luckin, and then Ms. Christodoulou?
I think it's an interesting way forward, and I can understand the rationale behind that, empowering existing authorities. My concern is that I worry that existing authorities don't have the in-depth knowledge about the technology to really be able to do a good job. I don't mean that in any insulting way to them whatsoever, but the technology is moving at a pace, it's increasingly complex. Even the people who are developing it don't always understand the implications of exactly what it does. And so I hope, in parallel with empowering those existing bodies, there will be a tremendous effort put into making sure that they actually do have the skills, the knowledge, the understanding of the technology in order to really be able to do their jobs with force. Because I think what we do have to recognise is that AI is a technology, I'm sure you all do recognise this, it's not going away, it's only going to become more prevalent, used by more people and have even greater impact. So it's super important that we make sure that people really do understand enough about it to be able to do that regulatory work. Indeed,
and the regulators in the school setting, one thinks of Ofsted and Ofqual. Are there others that you think might be in scope for this in the schools part of education?
I think this is a bigger question. I don't think we've put enough attention into educating people about AI. It's therefore really hard for me to point to any other organisations I feel that do have the knowledge both about education and about AI.
Right. Well,
so it's a bigger issue. I'm sorry if that's not a very satisfactory answer. It's just a key issue for me is the lack of attention that we've put to educating people about AI, beyond doing a great job at investing in STEM and investing particularly in universities to make sure we've got the technical skills about AI, but that's not the same thing.
Thank you. Well, the purpose of the inquiry is to make some recommendations. Perhaps I could ask the same question, just to start off with, to Ms. Christodoulou. Any initial thoughts, given I don't think it's even formally published yet, but we know what's in the press as to this intended approach. Does that ring right? Does that ring with you that this is the right approach?
I think I would agree with Rose in that one of the challenges with the new generative AI tools in particular is they are very complex, and as you say, you're absolutely right, sometimes their own developers don't really know exactly what they can and can't do, so there is a huge level of complexity there. So yeah, there has to be a concern that existing regulators, will they have their expertise? Having said that, if we're looking at within education specifically, I know that Ofqual have looked at this a few years ago and looked at the potential for AI to mark assessments. So I know it's something that's on their radar, and I think the immediate implication of a lot of the generative AI, the large language models, is probably going to involve assessment. So it probably makes sense if you want to move quickly that you empower the existing regulators to look at it. And I do think one of my other concerns, as well as the complexity of it, one of my other concerns is that a lot of organisations are moving very, very slowly on this, and whereas the speed of the adoption of the technology in society is much quicker.
And the tech companies.
And, I feel like there's, there are organisations who will end up setting up a working group to think about it in a year's time. Right. And by that point, you could have almost every student using it.
So pace is important.
Yeah, speed does matter here.
Absolutely. Good. Okay. So just on this point, given that this white paper is just being launched today, I'm just going to take a couple of questions on this before we go into some of your experience of AI in education. So starting with Stephen Metcalfe. Then Dawn.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It was just something you said, Professor Luckin, which was around the knowledge, people's knowledge of AI, and the lack of it and understanding. Do you have any suggestions, perhaps, of how we might improve that generally within the wider public? Because I think it is important they understand what AI is rather than just take their reference frame from what they might have seen on television or film.
Absolutely. I think we shouldn't underestimate the watershed moment this is. It's not that ChatGPT 4 or Dolly or any of these generative AI tools are cutting-edge technology. They have been around for several years. The huge difference in what has happened is that it's the first time in the history of the human race that people at scale have had access to an AI tool that they can use. It's very usable. It's there. It's just like when Google, I'm old enough to remember, when Google first appeared as a search engine. It was so different to anything else we'd ever had. And so people are using AI, and they know they're using AI. They've been used by AI for many years. So I think we mustn't underestimate the significance of what's happening here. In that scale, and therefore we have to recognise the scale of the need for education. So we do have to look in schools, in colleges, in universities, workplace training, to think about, well, what is it people really do need to understand about AI in order for them to be able to use it effectively and stay safe, thinking about your current, I've got an abnormally high heart rate. I'm not sure how useful that is.
I hope we haven't caused that so far.
I'm terribly sorry about that.
We asked the small question.
But perhaps that's because I do feel very strongly that we do need to look across the board at education and training. I love programming, I love technology, but not everybody does. And so I think we have to be careful not to approach it by expecting everybody to want to understand the intricacies of the technology, how it works, what it does, in understanding the maths behind neural networks or learning how to program in Python or whatever it might be. Lovely stuff for those who like it, but we need to find a way to help everybody to want to understand what this can do in very general terms, what it means to be artificially intelligent. And what I would suggest is that a way of doing that is to think very carefully about what it means to be intelligent as a human, and then understand the differences.
Absolutely. A final tiny question, which is really around, therefore, how do we teach that using our own intelligence, a degree of scepticism? Because actually, I, as an experiment, asked it, ChatGPT, to write a 300-word biography about me, which it did, but it was inaccurate in almost every... It was me, but it was inaccurate in all the detail. But no one else would know that necessarily.
Yes.
So it almost needs to come with a health warning.
It does. I have to laugh. I asked about AI in education and who should one talk to about AI in education, and I felt very flattered when I was number one on the list, but I don't think that's accurate. And I had the same experience. Yes, a healthy scepticism is important, and that comes from understanding that a tool like ChatGPT does not understand a word it produces. It has no conception of how those words apply in the real world. And once you grasp that, you can start to become much more sceptical. And once you learn how to write the sorts of prompts, the prompt engineering as we might call it, then you soon find out exactly what it can't do. It's incredibly useful. I use it. It's ever so useful. But it's just recognising that this is information collation. It's not knowledge. It's not understanding. It's collating vast amounts of information, and often incorrectly.
Absolutely.
It will get more accurate, though.
It will. But as
So
someone
I'll
once
drop off
said,
the list
there's
then.
nothing artificial and there's nothing intelligent about AI.
Thank you. On this theme, Dawn.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both. Just a question. There's the quickly, I think, Daisy, you mentioned like, okay, if we need to do something quickly, this is the way to do it. Is it sustainable and is it the best way? Are we going to get the best results? Are these organisations equipped to be able to educate people, as Rose was saying, or to protect people in regards to AI?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a really good point. And I have to say, you know, the speed of the way it's moving is quite disconcerting. It's been disconcerting for us as an organisation. And one of the challenges, just to go back to that previous point about education, is how do you educate people when it's moving so rapidly? And when also there are genuine debates between people within AI about exactly where it will end up. And I don't want to, you know, I'm not going to make huge predictions here, but I think the important thing to note is that people have quite strong disagreements about where it's going. And there are some people who will say it is only going to get better. You know, yes, it's making mistakes now, but it's going to be pretty flawless within a year or two. There are other people who are saying, no, that's not the case. And actually, it's, you know, it doesn't kind of have true understanding. And therefore, actually, some of the things it's producing, they're a bit like magic tricks, and it's not going to keep developing at pace. And I guess the reality is we don't know. And therefore, educating people and regulating is hard in that level of uncertainty. I think what probably is important to move quickly on, I think with some things perhaps you don't want to move quickly because of the uncertainty. So there's an argument in some cases for slowing down. I think in the places where regulators have to move quickly are in those areas where I would say within education it could have an immediate impact, and probably already is starting to have an impact, which is particularly if students are starting to use it to write work and hand in work. I think that's almost the most pressing, immediate need, where you would say, well, regulators and schools and universities need to be thinking about that, and they need to be thinking about their assessment models. And I don't always think there are easy answers to some of those questions. They're not straightforward, and institutions, that's what I think does have to be high up on their radar. Like it worries me, as I say, when I see institutions thinking, oh, we'll put a working group together about this in 6 months. You're like, well, no, it's happening now. Like, you need to be thinking about this now. So there may not be easy answers. It does propose challenges, but I do think for those areas that are immediately impacted by them, we do have to be thinking about it quickly.
Just one quick follow-up question, please, to both of you. What is the one thing that we must do sort of in this area to ensure safeguarding?
Do you want to go?
That's a very good question. What is the one thing we must do? I mean, look, people have discussions about schools have a lot of autonomy about what they do. I'm thinking about this specifically in the schools and university sort of sector. Schools and universities do have autonomy, and I think it's good that they have that autonomy, and they, you know, want to be making their decisions. They've got the latitude to make decisions on these, but yeah, I'm not. So I wouldn't be saying I think there should be something you want to mandate, but perhaps there does have to be something where there's some kind of formal conversation or something between, particularly maybe Ofqual and schools, about the impact on assessment. And in terms of the safeguarding, again, I'm thinking about this within the education and schools context. You've pointed out already that it makes a lot of mistakes. There's also risks of it. A lot of people have pointed out the way that some of it can go rogue, and it can start to say some quite dangerous things. So, yeah, those are things that you know, if there's, I don't know if there needs to be some kind of central sort of set of advice. As I say, you know, schools have autonomy, and I think in lots of ways that's a good thing. But I think there are important things about the impact on assessment and the impact, yeah, as you point out, on safeguarding and the kind of dangerous things it can say. We need to be taking those very seriously, and they're not necessarily easy issues to address.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that we have to work out how to do is change the balance of power. Because at the moment, the power is with the tech companies. We are here talking about this because a tech company has produced and made available a technology to everybody.
Yeah.
We've known this technology has been around for several years. People like myself and Daisy too, who've been talking about the need to think about AI in education for a long time, but it took this moment to wake people up. So we have to find a way of shifting the power. And for me, the only way I think you can shift the power is through education. through really helping people to understand. And I do feel, now I know, and I haven't had a chance to read the white paper, but I know there's an idea around a sandbox in it. And that might be a really useful educational tool if we could make it an educational tool. Because I think one way we might start to shift that power balance is by joining regulation and education together. So making the way the regulation is developed an educational process, so that then people start to realise why they need to care about this. Because we'll never, ever keep up. I mean, I completely agree with Daisy. Prediction is difficult.
Yeah.
I think I could quite confidently predict the technology will continue to advance. It will get better, but I agree. It won't be perfect, and it'll do things we're not expecting. We can't predict exactly how humans will react to it. We can predict that a lot of people will want to make money out of it and will make a lot of money out of it, and many of them will be unscrupulous. We can't predict precisely what that impact will have on people other than it's going to be potentially bad. We can also predict that there are so many good things that come out of this. So look at the things we can be sure of and try and work out how we educate people to be able to cope with the uncertainty of the things we can't be sure of. And I do feel having an educational aspect to regulation might be a way of starting to shift that power balance. Because as I said to your first question, Stephen, we do actually really need to educate everybody, but of course that's a huge task. So we've got to start somewhere.
Great, thank you.
Can I come in on one other thing, actually?
It's very brief because we do need to get on to
Okay.
some other questions.
If there is one thing, the one thing you could do, I hesitate to say this because I don't think it's sort of that realistic, but the one thing that I think we as an organisation and a lot of organisations would love to know is, particularly in the case of OpenAI, how they've trained their model. And they haven't released that. So they're called OpenAI, but there's a lot of closed aspects of what they're doing. And that makes it incredibly hard to evaluate what it does and incredibly hard to evaluate how it produces its results. So there is an element of AI, which there's just inevitably a bit of a black box that you'll never, even the developers themselves might not know how it's producing its outputs, but there's an element of AI where they could be more open. And certainly they've published some aspects of how it's trained, but not the full details. And so I think that will be a really future area of regulation, not just in this country, but globally, of to what extent do you force organisations like OpenAI to actually open up and share how they train their models.
I do note that one of the 5 principles that the government have set out today for the governance of AI is transparency and explainability. So, and if that's to be applied to regulators, we'll want to go into some more detail on that. Thank you for that. That was the useful kind of snap reaction to what's been put out today. What we want to do for the rest of the session is to benefit from your understanding of how AI is currently being applied and what seems to be around the corner in schools. So perhaps I could start with Ms. Christodoulou and just describe the reality now of the deployment of AI in school settings as you see it. And if we could keep the answers brief, because we've got, as you see, lots of members eager to ask lots of questions.
Sure. So I think the reality of the deployment at the moment is probably, what's that line, the future's here, it's just unevenly distributed. There's an uneven distribution, and I think there's some teachers and some students who have started using it a lot, and there's some who kind of haven't heard of it, so it's spreading. I think in terms of, what are the areas where people are using it and looking at it, well, you've got the kind of the problematic areas where students using it to cheat, and I think that's already starting to see that that's an issue. You've got issues, can teachers use it to plan resources and to create questions?
How it is being used at the moment, for those of us that are not in the education world, how is it being used?
By teachers?
By teachers and students?
Yeah. So as I say, I think by teachers, you've got someone coming up next on the next panel. You've got teachers who are using it to create resources. So a lot of what teachers spend their time on will be planning lessons and creating resources. And I know that lots of them will use ChatGPT to help with that. So I'll give one example where I think it does work really well. It is very good at summarising, at text summarising. So if you take a sort of complex-ish text, maybe from Wikipedia, something that you kind of vouch for the accuracy, so Wikipedia is a good example. If you pop it into ChatGPT and say, can you rewrite this so it's appropriate for a 10-year-old, it does quite a good job. So that's quite useful. So things like that, it can do. And something like that, it doesn't tend to make too many mistakes either. You can, because you're kind of giving it the information. So something like that can be pretty useful. I've also, seen lots of teachers and lots of education organisations using it to create questions. This is where it gets more problematic. the more sort of open you make it and the more you give it more latitude, it does make a lot of errors. It makes an awful lot of errors. And I've got a little collection of them that we're sort of storing up.
When you say questions
for students
as part of teaching, or questions for exams, presumably.
For parts of teaching. For example, at the end of a lesson on Pythagoras' theorem, you want to give students a few questions, and maybe you've got some already that you've created, but it's always nice to have more, and you might want to mix it up a bit. And so you ask ChatGPT, can you give me a question about Pythagoras' theorem, and it will do it. The problem is it makes mistakes. And I mentioned Pythagoras' theorem because that's one of the ones we've looked at, and it's a really baffling mistake that it keeps making, where it essentially confuses 14 squared and 13 squared. And 13 squared is 169 and 14 squared is 196, and I'm convinced it's just mixing up the numbers.
Dyslexic.
I don't want to say that, but yeah, maybe who knows. So if you want to use it in schools, it's nowhere near just being able to automate and put it out there.
And how widespread is it? So you say that it can be used to generate questions at the end of a lesson. Yeah. How widespread would you say that is being used currently by students, by teachers?
I genuinely don't know. I haven't seen any data on it. I would suggest that I would say at the minute, it's probably a small percentage of quite enthusiastic teachers. I would suggest, but I don't know. I haven't seen any data on it. That's my feeling.
Professor Luckin, do you have a perception as to what the current uses are at the moment and how widespread they might be?
You mean the current uses of ChatGPT?
No, of AI.
Right,
yes.
okay. So there's quite a long history here. Mm-hmm. There's a great deal of difference between what happens in research and what happens in practice. And I'm going to talk about what happens in practice because I think that's what you're interested in. So, two characteristics of AI are super important here: adaptivity and autonomy. So we can use AI to build adaptive systems that will help a learner progress at their own speed, so to speak. And there are a lot of them around. They might alter the difficulty of the task the student set in order to better meet that student's need. They might alter the nature of the support, the hints, the tips that are given in order to support that student to be successful. And then they can give good quality feedback to teachers. Many of them have been around for quite a long time. There's lots of data to suggest they're pretty good. Not all of them. The well-designed ones are pretty good. And studies that have been conducted with those systems have demonstrated that they are as good at tutoring, not teaching, tutoring as a human tutor when working with a whole class, remembering that the AI is working one-to-one. So they're not as good as a human working on a one-to-one, but how many students would get that?
Teaching versus tutoring. Just explain the difference.
So teaching is a far richer activity than tutoring. Tutoring is just part of it. But that's very useful, because if you can have an AI system that can do part of the teaching job and that can give you as a teacher really good feedback about your students, then you know as the human teacher where to offer your support in particular. So very useful technologies that have been around for a while.
Just to pause on that for a second. So would it be right in thinking that in, say, a mixed ability class that was studying a particular subject, it might be possible to have tailored to the particular either level or learning styles, learning preferences of individual students for that common subject, different approaches? Would that be?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. And the important part is that you get feedback as a teacher and you get feedback as a learner. You can also get feedback as a parent. So you have a British company like Century Tech is a very popularly used platform, not just in the UK. Elsewhere. There are other companies too. In the US, Carnegie University's Carnegie Learning have produced these kind of systems for several decades and improved them all the time. So we know that. There are also ways in which AI can help teachers track down the most appropriate resources for their students. So a different kind of adapting. So it's not adapting to the student, it's adapting to the teacher's needs for those students. If you see what a difference is, not directly teaching, it's just helping the teacher find the resources that are out there and available that best meet their needs. Yeah. So these kind of systems have also been around. We've also got AI being used to analyse and interpret students' facial expressions, students' voice data, mainly in the university sector, but we have systems that are being used that aren't just research tools, whereby we know the combination of data captured about facial expression when combined with data captured about voice is much more reliable than either of those modalities individually at helping you understand if a student is particularly stressed or anxious. You don't need a watch saying your heart rate is going up, and therefore if you are, for example, a counselling AI, you can adapt what you're doing to that student's needs. So there's a lot of stuff out there that is being used. It's not, Daisy is so right, it's absolutely not evenly distributed because it all costs money. The other type of AI that is being used, but exactly as you've said, it depends on the teacher and their enthusiasm, are just the normal tools like, dictation. AI is really good at transcription these days. Things like voice-activated personal assistants, where you get your students talking, maybe in a foreign language. Does the voice-activated assistant understand them? Oh, that's interesting. No, it doesn't. So tools that are readily available for teachers who understand a little bit, they can see how they can integrate them into the lessons. But again, it's not evenly spread out. But it would be a mistake to think that it isn't out there already. It is.
Exactly. Well, that's extremely helpful. And this committee's had a long interest in this. The predecessor committee published a report in algorithms in decision making, and so it's our inquiry is very much in a tradition of advice to the government on this. But perhaps just a final word on, given what you've described as the current deployment, is there any evidence that AI improves student outcomes?
That is a really interesting question. There is evidence that we can improve student outcomes with the kind of AI that's now being developed that can track the learning process, not just the learning product. But a lot of these are not necessarily quite available at scale yet, but some of them are just starting to come out. And it's certainly, there is a growing body of evidence that for students who might have been falling through the net, they can be helped to be brought back into the pack, if you see what I mean. Sorry, not very good language, really, but you get what I'm saying. So it's not so much on, are the GCSE results going up, but certainly this student might now actually have a chance of sitting that GCSE where they didn't without it, because busy teachers, if they have this technology available to them, are able to make sure that students who have a particular need can learn at their own pace, and as a teacher they get that feedback. So yes, and that will get better.
Good. Well, that's very clear. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go to my colleagues now, starting with a former science teacher. Do you want to come in, Graham?
Very quickly, follow. That's very interesting. Is the quality of the evidence about improvement in student performance, is that from controlled experiments, or is it just from observation and comparing with previous?
Most of the evidence that I would consider to be good quality is still in the research space. So there may be some controlled trials amongst that. The reason I'm hesitating is they won't necessarily have been conducted in the classroom environment. And until that happens, you can't be sure exactly what will and won't play out. Because it's one thing for something to work in a lab environment, it's quite another, or a carefully curated environment, even if it is a school classroom. But often in these studies, what you don't see is what's going on behind the scenes to make it work. What we need is some evaluations of the tools at scale, where we would be able to get the kind of quality data that you are talking about. We are starting to see data, but it's the independence of the data that's really important. So a lot of the data you'll see will come from people who are building the systems, and I like to see some independent data as well. But we're starting to see that in research studies, and again, that will grow. So expect to see more and more. And as we get better at using AI to track the learning process, we will see even more important data coming out about how interventions in a timely manner in that learning process will produce much better learning outcomes. But this is quite new, and it's not out there at scale yet. But it's kind of watch this space. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Graham. So I was introducing Carol as a former science teacher, and Carol's got some questions for both witnesses.
Thanks very much, and it's utterly fascinating. I left teaching 8 years ago when I became an MP, and things obviously we were starting to see the use of some of these tools in a very basic way whenever I left teaching, but it's interesting. But I want to ask, first of all, about exams. Now, exams have a kind of developed over history, and exams, one of the reasons that exams were introduced was to kind of level the playing field, because before that, you know, you would have people from privileged backgrounds being able to go and present themselves to a university and get entry to a university. Exams allowed a much wider range of people to access this. We're becoming more aware, certainly probably over the last 10 years, that some young people will struggle in an exam situation and are not reaching their potential in an exam situation. So we're seeing more the use of continual assessment in order to determine awards in national exams. Having listened to what you're saying this morning about the use of, for example, ChatGPT to come up with essays or assignments, do we need to have a good, hard look at our exam methodology, our assessment methodology once again?
So yeah, I can take that. I mean, yeah, obviously I work in assessment. This is what we do. This is our day job. And yes, I think we do. I need to have a good hard look at how we assess. And I do think that ChatGPT has huge implications for continuous assessment and coursework. I think it's very hard to see how that continues. And I've heard a few suggestions about different things you could do. But I think, some of the people making those suggestions don't realise quite how powerful a tool like ChatGPT is. That it is capable of producing original, very hard to detect, relatively high quality responses to any kind of question. And they won't be perfect, but they'll be good enough for a lot of students. And I think that means that uncontrolled assessments, assessments where you're not sure how the students produce that work, become very, very problematic. So I do think we have to be thinking that there is a value in having exams, in having those traditional exams, that you know that's how the students produced it, that it is their own work, that it is their own thinking. It is very, very hard to spot ChatGPT tasks. We did some research on this. We got ChatGPT to write 8 responses to a task we ran recently, an assessment of 8-year-olds writing. And it was only 8-year-olds, I know, and we're going to repeat it with some older students. But we found, first of all, that those 8 essays, we were doing an assessment with 50,000 8-year-olds. Of those 8 pieces, I think all of the ones that we designed, to be the good ones, they came out in like the top few percent. So they essentially reached the limit of that ceiling. We also asked our teachers when they were assessing them to see if they could spot them, and basically they couldn't. They were more likely to pick an essay that had been written by a real child and say that had been written by ChatGPT than they were to spot the ChatGPT essay. So it writes very good essays that are very hard to detect by humans. I've heard people talk about, can we get the AI to check the AI? Have AI plagiarism detectors. The research I've seen on that is not encouraging. We've, again, sort of tried that, tried some of the models that are out there at the minute. They don't have high accuracy rates of being able to spot them. So these are the things that I do think we have to be looking at and thinking about. And I think there's an element where I think there's a few educational institutions who are sticking their heads in the sand and they want to pretend they want it to go away. And I think you've had a problem at universities probably for years now with essay mills. Because essay mills have been like maybe a relatively small percentage, I think people are able to pretend it's not happening. You're not going to be able to pretend this isn't happening because it's got the potential for 100% of students to be using it in very rapid time. Now, there is a question at universities like, will it be able to produce university level essays? But again, the point is, even if it can only produce them at like the 50, 60th percentile, by definition, that's going to be good enough for 50, 60% of pupils, of students, right? That they're going to get some value from it. The other thing about it is, it's just so easy. It's so easy to just type in a question and get a response.
Yeah, I mean, I a few weeks ago gave a keynote speech to an academic audience, and it was about the use of AI in healthcare. Right. And I decided I was going to start this speech with a chunk from ChatGPT. So I'd asked it to write my introduction. I'd asked it to include a joke, which it did. So I delivered the first 2 minutes from ChatGPT with a joke that everyone laughed along with. And at the end of it, I told the audience that that was ChatGPT. Now, of course, you could see the faces. There wasn't quite a sharp intake of breath, but clearly I delivered something that was good enough for an academic audience. Quite disturbingly, though, I had a couple of my own jokes later in the thing that didn't go down so well. So maybe ChatGPT does better, but can I maybe, so there is an issue in terms of how we are assessing. We talked about coursework and essays. That's a big issue. What about in terms of the scientific subjects? Yeah. I mean, what can it produce if I set a physics assignment to my students? How is it going to cope with that?
So there was some study data out with GPT-4 in the past just few weeks where people gave it a bunch of the American grad school exams for a whole range of subjects. So yes, some science ones, some medical ones, law, whatever, and apparently it kind of aced them all. You know, it did very well at all of them. So even, I think for something like physics, for things like that, it is very good at solving those questions and answering those assessments. And as I say, I personally would say, I think the response to that has to be, we have to be looking at assessments that are in more controlled environments. And I recognise, I was an English teacher, that for some subjects that is not easy. And I totally understand that, particularly at university level, where the model of going away and writing an essay is really important. So I'm not pretending this is going to be straightforward. But I just think, as you've pointed out, its ability to produce very good, very fluent prose that's very hard to distinguish is something that you cannot ignore.
You've also analysed ChatGPT's performance at assessing different pieces of work. How did it go on with that?
Right, so this is where it's less good. So this is kind of the problem for us at the moment, is that I feel like all the things that it's good at scale within education feel like less socially useful things. So it's very good at kind of basically cheating, giving students essays that are not their own. It's very good at that, and it can do that at scale and can do it rapidly. For the more socially useful things in education, as I talked about, creating questions, but also marking, it's not as good as we'd hoped. So we have done the work to plug ChatGPT into our assessment systems. We can now quite easily compare human judging and AI judging, quite rapidly. And it doesn't make the same decisions as humans. It makes quite odd and baffling decisions. It's not making the right decisions at scale. And the other thing about it is, and this is where you get the difference between the kind of old AI systems and these newer LLMs, is that the great advantage of kind of previous AI systems and the narrow AI systems, a lot of which we use in our back office, is that they're reliable, they're repeatable. You give them a question one day and they give an answer, and you come back a week later and they'll give it the same answer. With GPT, that is not the case. And in some ways, that's the strength of it. But for something like marking, it's a weakness. So you ask it to mark an essay one day, and it'll give it 1 mark, and then you come back 5 minutes later and ask it again, and it gives it something totally different.
What about non-essay marking? What about, again, talking about science and maths?
So even with that, again, we haven't experimented with that, but I've been talking to people who have, and it does weird things. So, for example, you'll get it up and running and you'll think you've got it working, and you'll get it marking some multiple choice questions and it'll be giving them all a mark, and then suddenly it'll switch and it'll start giving half marks. So it does odd things. Yeah. It's not reliable. And everyone keeps saying, we're waiting for our ChatGPT 4 API key. So everything I say here, maybe tomorrow we'll get our API 4 key, GPT 4 API key, and maybe this will all change. But where we are at the minute, from what it's doing, it's just not doing things reliably enough, and it's not consistent enough, and it makes weird errors. And there's no way you could use it even in, I would say, like a low-stakes system at scale for actually assigning marks to essays. The other concern we have, as I said before, I'm not even sure it can count. In the process it has of assigning a number to a mark, like we're not sure how it's doing that. And that goes back to some of the training issues. Where it might be a little bit better is at providing some feedback, providing a kind of general package of feedback. And that's something we're looking at a little bit. So if I was going to kind of, give it a grade, I'd say it's absolutely brilliant at producing essays for students that aren't their own. Mm-hmm. It's not very good at marking. And on giving some sort of general ideas for feedback, I'd give it, yes, maybe there's some potential there. I'll put that in the middle.
Of course, multiple choice questions are the easiest for any teacher to mark. I mean, bang, 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 bang. So
we've actually built, we've been using for a few years now, a narrow AI system to recognise multiple choice questions on a grid. ticks and crosses, and that works beautifully. It's not very glamorous, but it works very well, and it's very repeatable, and it cuts down teachers' workload. So there are these narrow uses of AI which aren't very glamorous but are very repeatable, which I think are fantastic.
And transparent.
And transparent, and we can see, we've got a mathematical model, we can see exactly why it's doing what it's doing, and Rose talked about some of those as well. So those models, I think there's a lot of potential there. GPT is just, at the minute, I think a lot of people working with it would say there's a lot of baffling things about it.
Sorry, Professor.
Can I just come in and... Something's worrying me about this. I think that's true for ChatGPT, but a different large language model that was trained on a more accurate data set would do better at marking.
Right.
But I don't think that's the question. Because what you drew attention to was the fact that originally exams were introduced to try and bring about equality. Now, to my mind...
We seem to have forgotten that in some
exactly,
of this discussion.
but this is a fabulous opportunity. Because, to my mind, if we now have an AI that can pass our assessments, of course, in the short term, we have to do all of this worrying about how we deal with the fact that we can't change assessment overnight, so how are we going to deal with this fact? But longer term, in truth, if I can have a system that does not understand anything and has no idea how any of this applies to the real world, isn't there something wrong with the assessment in the first place?
So, Rose, I would fundamentally disagree with that. I've agreed with everything you've said so far, but I think you're wrong on that.
Let Professor
Can I just explain?
develop the point, and then perhaps we might...
Because this is what it's all about. What does it mean to know something? And I'm afraid our education system is not based on... It may be called knowledge-based curriculum, but it's not. It's an information-based curriculum. It's beautifully designed, and I understand why people are so committed to it. But it will not produce people who really, really understand. And this is what ChatGPT is drawing our attention to. Because it collates information, and it collates information, much greater bodies of information than we will ever be able to collate. And what's happened here is that over the years, we have, of course, developed AI in our own image, because we don't have another image of intelligence. We've only got our own image of intelligence, so we build it in our own image. And we build it to do the things that we value. Now I think we have to have a serious think, long term. What is it to be intelligent as a human? What are the real characteristics of human intelligence that we want our populations to have? And surely they are not the ones that we can easily automate. Surely they are the ones that we cannot easily automate. And believe me, there are a lot of them. I'm old enough to have been working in a computer science and AI department when IBM's big chess playing machine beat Gary Kasparov at chess. And I remember the excitement. People were cock-a-hoop. We've cracked it. We've cracked intelligence. We can beat Gary Kasparov at chess. Yay, us. Almost as much hubris as ChatGPT. And then, over the coming months and years, people realised that some of the things that we took for granted, vision, for example, much, much, much harder to do. It's taken us decades, and we're still not perfect, than chess. But we thought chess was a signifier of intelligence. We need to look at what it is to be humanly intelligent. We need to work out, because if we don't get that right, we won't work out the right relationship that humans must have to artificially intelligent systems. Because we don't want to repeat. We want to use these systems to make us smarter. That's the most important thing.
I'm aware we could talk about this all day, but
Perhaps
sure,
it's just
It'd
from
be a huge
just
power for
Christodoulos,
equality, which is where you started. Because it might help us if we get it right, and we use these great techniques for analysing learning processes and being able to highlight some of these uniquely human features of our intelligence. We might open up, qualifications to populations that have previously been denied them. It's a fantastic opportunity, but we have to recognise that we've got to move on from where we are now.
Now, Ms. Christodoulou signified dissent to something that Professor Luckin said, so perhaps you explain
I've agreed
that.
with lots of what Rose has said earlier on. I agree with quite a bit of what she said there. I'll just tease out the disagreement. I do agree, absolutely, that we need to be focusing on real human understanding, and I would also agree with Rose that I don't think GPT has that. And I think we do need to be focusing on what it is that makes us human and getting that human understanding. Where I think the difference is when you say the things we need to be focused on in schools are not the things we can easily automate. I disagree with that. And the reason I disagree with that is for a couple of reasons. So first of all, we do want students to have those advanced skills, the skills that computers and AI don't have. But what we also know is that in order to get those advanced skills, there's no shortcut. You can't short circuit. You have to go through the basics. So the students are unfortunately going to have to spend time grappling with the problems that AI can solve immediately and that can be automated immediately, because they can't get to the more advanced ones without that. And chess, you mentioned chess. Chess is a fascinating case study here for a number of reasons, because chess, everyone thought that Deep Blue and AI would kill chess. They thought the minute a computer solved chess, no one wants to play anymore. The reverse has happened. There has been a boom in chess. People love chess. But when you teach a child to play chess now, do you say to them, look, don't bother learning how the pieces move. You need to focus on the strategy, focus on the things the AI can't do. Of course not. For a student to get good at chess, they have to learn the pieces first of all. And the way that computers have affected chess education is not by telling students, don't worry about the basics, don't worry about the things a computer can do. It's actually been by developing some really interesting new training patterns. And so, things like chesskids.com, really interesting new ways of teaching chess that do focus on the basics, but do it in a fun way. That's the impact technology has had on chess. So we can't be saying to students, don't bother with the things that computers can do. That's just going to be, it's going to stop them getting the skills they do need. The second thing is, just because a computer can do something doesn't mean there isn't value for a human to do it. So we didn't stop teaching PE when the car got invented. We didn't stop teaching drawing when cameras were invented. If ChatGPT can read better than a lot of humans, we're not going to stop teaching reading, because you get a tremendous amount of value from reading. You don't have to be as good a reader as ChatGPT to get value from it. So I think the risk of this is that we just end up defining education completely, instrumentally, and saying, well, we've got to, every time ChatGPT can do something new, we're going to change our curriculum and we shouldn't teach kids that. So I think we absolutely, I agree with Rose, we've got to be focusing on human understanding on what that is. And perhaps the positive of GPT, it will make us think more about what that is, but that doesn't mean abandoning the basics or the fundamentals.
That's
I never said we should abandon the basics.
You did say we should automate. You should say we shouldn't be teaching. I wrote it down. You did say we shouldn't be looking at the things we can easily automate.
Okay.
And I disagree with that.
We like spirited witnesses in this. Let's. Dawn had a question that she communicated via our system on the implications for more exams. Do you want to just put that to the witnesses, Dawn?
I'm just wondering, how do we level the playing field? If ChatGPT can write essays really well, does that mean we're going to go back to having more intensified exams in exam environments, which is what we were moving away from?
I really hope not.
I think it does, and I think it should.
Well, let's hear from Professor Luckin first. You give your
Exams are stressful. They don't produce accurate outcomes. They are outdated. They're not part of the learning process. What I was trying to say, and I clearly didn't say it clearly enough, is that what we teach children of the basics is fundamentally important, but it should be a tool to help them gain the more advanced human intelligence. So yes, you still have to do it, but not
so we should still teach things you can automate. Can we agree on that? Yes.
one at a time, otherwise it's difficult to.
Sure, I agree with that.
Tools
Then I
to
totally agree.
reach the higher education,
Absolutely.
and these should not be the things we assess.
I think
as
they should be the things we
final
assess. I do think we
part
should
of
assess them.
education.
Yeah.
Because if we assess the more advanced skills, we will, in the process, be
I think we should
assessing
assess
those
both.
fundamentals.
We should assess the fundamentals and the.
I think
and
we're
the
saying
advanced.
the
Let
same
Professor Luckin
thing.
finish, then I will come to you.
We're just
to do that.
seeing it in a slightly different way. Because, as I was saying earlier about being able to track the learning process, you can track very nicely using continual assessment exactly how much somebody is learning of the very basic things they do need to understand. I couldn't agree more. So we don't need those final exams. Once we get our technology sorted, and most importantly, once we get our data infrastructure sorted within our education system, and actually the UK is good in this respect, and we can build on what's there, then there will be less need for these final exams. So I think in the short term, I totally understand why Daisy's saying, look, this is a way of stopping cheating. I get that. But it should be a short-term fix, not the long-term goal. The long-term goal has to be to sit down and look at what do we really want people to be able to understand and do through our education system.
Ms. Christodoulou, what's your response to
Yeah,
that?
so I think, you know, you're absolutely right to make the distinction between we have a final end goal, and then we can break that end goal down into steps on the way, and we can look at what those steps on the way are, and you can do that for lots of different subjects. Often the steps on the way don't look like the end goal. I think you need to assess both. I think you need to be assessing the end goal. So those advanced skills we're talking about, like essay writing, complex maths problem solving, complex science problem solving. You then also need to be looking at, right, well, what are the steps on the way that are going to get you there? Because you can't start assessing 6-year-olds with those complex advanced problems, right? You've got to be breaking it down into the smaller steps. And that's actually what a lot of the good AI systems you were talking about do. You know, they're taking the complex skills, they're breaking them down, they're thinking, how do we best teach and assess those? So that's what we do at No More Marking, the company I work for. We do big assessments of essays, complex assessments of advanced skills. We also then break those skills down into small steps, and we offer schools a multiple choice tool to be able to design multiple choice questions that will lead up to that end goal. So I definitely think you need to do both. I think you need to assess both. I think you need to pick the right assessment and the right assessment structure for each. I think that the coming of GPT does just mean that doing any of those assessments in uncontrolled conditions just puts you in a situation where you don't know if that work has been completed by the student or not. So that's why I think you have to have exams.
All right, let's take some more questions from my colleagues on this theme. It's important to say that our inquiry is not into ChatGPT, it's into AI generally, and that's one and only one particular tool. But Aaron Bell.
Yeah, sorry, at the risk of continuing this a bit, is the analogy not with when pocket calculators came in the 80s, and that basically changed arithmetic fundamentally? They were originally seen as cheating, and then and obviously there was also an equity issue when the calc came in because they cost a lot of money in the first place, and only some students had them, and they were banned. And then we actually realised it was more sensible because everyone's going to have access to computers and calculators when they're older, that we don't need to do as much long division, or we certainly don't need to do slide rules. We do all of that. If the future is for people are going to use tools like ChatGPT or whatever comes after ChatGPT to do creative work when they're an adult in their adult lives, do we not need a system that embraces that, but maybe not, as you said, Daisy, not at primary school, because we don't let year 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds play with calculators to learn how to add up, but it's all about those building blocks.
So this is it. I think what we need to think about is how do we get students to have the advanced skills. So I am completely with you and with Rose on the aim has to be the advanced skills. The question is how do we get there? And what we know is that it is really important to have stored fluently in long-term memory a body of facts, and that is what often allows you to do a lot of the creative thinking. And that chess point I made, you have to know how the pieces move, is the point. And that's why with calculators we do still have exams for primary age students where they're calculator free, because there is a value in getting to fluency. And it's the same as, if you're reading a book, you can always look something up, not just on Google, but in a dictionary. Dictionaries existed for longer than pocket calculators, but we all know that if you have to stop, if you don't understand 70% of the words in a text, and you have to stop all that time to look up a word, your fluency of your reading's gone. It's not just pocket calculators. Any reference source, they're often fantastic for people who have that kind of fundamental knowledge and skills to be able to access them. But for the students who don't have those basics, they don't help them. So I do think a large part of primary and even secondary schooling has to be about making sure that students have those fundamental basic skills and knowledge that they need to be able to develop the more advanced skills and to use all these tools really effectively.
In lots of ways it's meant that at secondary level in particular, I completely agree about building blocks, that maths is a very different subject now at GCSE to what it was at O level, and my question is, is it not the case that is how English and history and other subjects will change as well?
I don't know. To what extent maths is and isn't a different subject. I've got a copy at home of the first exams in England in 1869, and you're right, 1859 I think it is. And you're right, the maths curriculum is quite different. I'm not sure all those reasons are to do with pocket calculators. There's a lot more statistics in modern maths. I'm quite keen on that, especially given the organisation I work for. We use a lot of stats, but I don't think that's necessarily come about. That's come about because, we've seen it as being more useful. So what I think when you're saying, does the curriculum need to change, we need to be thinking concretely about how would you change it. I still think in the case of English, as a former English teacher, the skills of reading and writing are going to be phenomenally important, both at advanced level in terms of sort of the economic value they add, but also, something we can often forget when we talk about this, just in terms of the personal value they bring. The ability to read a novel or read a poem and enjoy that is very important too. So it feels to me that in terms of English, reading and writing are always going to be important. They're fundamental skills that underpin everything else. We know that in the UK, as in some other countries, we have unfortunately a number of students who don't have the literacy skills they need to engage in the modern world. So it feels to me those are all really important things that we need to focus on. We can't get distracted by thinking we can just forget about the basics and because ChatGPT will do that and we can just focus on the higher level stuff. You have to go through the basics to get to that higher level.
Professor Luckin?
It's such an interesting question, and it's a very complicated answer, actually, because absolutely, literacy and numeracy, fundamental, have to have those in there. But the calculator issue is an interesting one, because the calculator isn't intelligent. And what we're talking about here is something much more sophisticated. Now, if I look at a high-level skill, say something like metacognition, we know that people with sophisticated metacognition do better. They do better in the world of work, they do better in their learning outcomes, we know that. Now, to teach metacognition, you can't do it in a vacuum. You have to teach it within a subject area. So that speaks to Daisy's point about the need for subject areas. We also know that it's different at primary school because it's a developmental aspect. So the way that you would go about teaching metacognition through a subject area, maybe science, maybe English, whatever, is different in a primary school to a secondary school. But the point I'm making is that by focusing on the metacognition rather than the subject, and seeing the subject, taking literacy and numeracy as givens, we have to have those and high quality versions of those, and seeing alters the way that you teach, and it alters the way that you assess. And that's what's important here. It's not that I'm saying we don't need those basic things, it's just that we need them in a different way, because we want to have the situation where we continue to be the most intelligent form of intelligence. And there's a very important issue here that I think has to be grasped, and that is the risk of offloading. Now, our brains are naturally lazy.
Yeah.
And therefore, we will, of course, as is being shown at the moment with ChatGPT, if something else can do something for us, we're highly likely to offload. Oh, I don't like doing this. It's making me think hard.
Yeah.
There's this system that can do this. We do not want that to happen. Now, in order for us to be productive, it could be effective to offload certain things. The most important thing we need to decide is what are the things we are happy to offload and what are the things we are not happy to offload. And we need to consciously design systems that recognise that we will want to offload.
And fight against ourselves.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we need to work out, and that's where the AI, if we link beyond ChatGPT, can be super helpful.
Thank you.
Because as I was saying to your colleague, we are now getting very good at taking data signals and learning about the process that a learner is going through. And when I was a teacher in further education teaching adults with special needs, I would have loved to have known what was going on. I could have been so much better than I was. Now, if we do that, you can't cheat with that. You can't cheat with that. That's your data. And formative assessment using AI is a way that we can really move forward with assessment where it's less stressful, it's in the background, we can't cheat with it, and we can use the AI on this. Now, there are ethical implications of that. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's possible and it's not a long way off. So we need to recognise that this stuff is coming and we can use it, and it will hit that point of equality if we design it in the right way.
Thank you. Because of the human rather than machine interactions this morning, we're running over time, so I'm going to have to ask my colleagues to be brief in their questions and our witnesses to be brief in the answers.
I'll be very brief. Thank you, Chair. Could I just ask, all witnesses in this inquiry have been reluctant to answer this question, but 10 years' time, do you think education will look fundamentally different as a result of AI, or is it just going to be an incremental improvement? Briefly, first Professor Luckin, and then...
Absolutely it will.
Fundamentally
There's no
different.
question it will look fundamentally different. It's how it will look fundamentally different. So a few years ago I said that I could see the dystopian and I could see my optimistic version that I want. Dystopian version is, because it's cheap, we could have a horrible future where we have most of the population being educated by AI teaching machines with some minders and a bit of, you know, looking after because it's cheap and we can track what people are learning, etc., etc. And then we'll have people who can afford it having the rich human interactions integrated with the AI, all of the good stuff. That's horrible. But we are at risk of that happening. What we can do, but we really do have to make the decisions now. And we do have to get over the fact that we've invested a huge amount of energy in designing something that's beautifully designed. Our current curriculum is really beautifully designed, but it has to change because the world is changing. And if we want the optimistic version where we go back to the reason we had exams in the first place, where we go back to wanting to bring about equality, we have to look at the situation differently.
Ms. Christine.
So I agree about the dystopian vision, and I think that's the thing that a lot of people with AI in education worry about, is it just going to be kids sitting in front of screens with eye trackers and kind of, you know, rewards for if they get certain questions right. And I agree you don't want that, but I'm fairly optimistic on that, because I think not only does that not sound very nice, I don't think people want that, and I don't think kids want it. And I think you saw in the pandemic, if that was going to happen, it would have happened, and it didn't, because people want people wanted to get back to school.
Sure.
So when you say what will education look like in 10 years, I actually think this depends on how you define look. I actually think it could look quite similar, in that I think children I think the physical aspect of schools is important. And the physical place matters. So I think there's a way in which schools might look very similar to schools today, but I think that what goes on around them and how everything works around them could have been transformed. And the analogy I often like to use is maybe if you're sitting down to eat dinner, that in lots of ways there's aspects of that are very similar to sitting down to eat dinner maybe 100 years ago, but the food on your plate and everything around that has been completely transformed by technology. And so that might be an analogy, that things might look the same, but the nature of what's going on there, that technology in all kinds of ways has the potential to transform that for the better.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Erin. And finally, Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question around a difficult subject of bias. Where do the AI tools developed by edtech firms source their data?
Depends on the AI company. Sorry, that's not meant to be a facetious answer. But it's a really good question. And it's a question that anybody who's thinking about buying any of those systems should be asking. Where is your data coming from? What are you doing with that data? Explain it to me in a way that I understand. And don't tell me it's commercially sensitive and you can't tell me, because that's rubbish. You can. Because I think that's a really important question. We have to know where the data is coming from, how reliable it is, how representative it is of the population who's going to be using that system, how much it's updated. And the big point that Daisy made earlier about not knowing what OpenAI are doing with the data that they have. We know nothing about what they're doing with the data they're collecting every time anybody types anything into it. And so again, the same question to what you're asking, what happens to the data that is being put into these systems? Does it add to the pool of data from which the system learns? And in which case, are we increasing the bias because of the people who are using it? Do you see what I mean? So it's a really, really important question. And we have to empower people to ask that question and know how to ask that question, which incidentally, the Institute for Ethical AI and Education that produced a report a couple of years ago did try and help educators understand the questions to ask when procuring AI. And some of that was around data, because you're right, it's really important.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a distinction. I think a lot of the narrow AI sort of applications, they'll be coming up with their own sets of training data for whatever that's for. And, so often they'll be using human judgments that they've gathered previously to help predict, make the judgments for the model. So that would be that. I think you're right, the issue with GPT is, as I said earlier, we don't know what it's been trained on. And that's a huge issue for working anything out to do with bias. A lot of the narrow AI models, they might not be completely transparent. There's an element of opacity to all of this, but you will be able to at least see, you should be able to see kind of what they've been trained on and therefore kind of how they're making their decisions. So definitely come back to what I said before. One of the key things about regulation probably is going to be the transparency of the training data.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dawn. And Tracy Crouch, very finally.
Very quick question, and my apologies for being late. This has been a fascinating session. Professor Luck, you said either we need to be or we want to be the most intelligent form of intelligence, which is a really, really interesting phrase. Do you think we can be?
I do, yes, but I think we have to really make the right decisions. You know, the brain is amazing. There's so much of it that we're learning about now, and it's so far beyond what AI can do. Every time we think we've got closer to artificial general intelligence, there will be some aspect of what we can do, and people go, oh, yeah, there's that too. So I do think we can. But what I think is interesting is that in a lot of the ways that regulators and indeed large organisations who are making an awful lot of money out of AI talk about the situation is, don't worry, we'll have a human in the loop. We'll have a human in the loop, it'll all be all right because there'll be a human in the loop. What if that human doesn't understand AI? You know, because if we don't do the helping the human to get to the place where they can be the useful human in the loop, they're not actually that useful. Sorry, I hope that's helpful. But
No, it's very helpful. I request not to be that human.
Yes.
Actually, Carol just wanted to ask a quick question.
Yeah, the chair is indulging me. Final question. I'm just wondering, I mean, we're talking a lot about where we are here in the UK. I'm just wondering, are there interesting aspects of AI being used in education in other countries? Where should we be looking to get a good example or a bad example?
Look at China for a bad example. That's fairly obvious, but it's scary. But there's a lot to be learnt from that, in all fairness, because obviously they're the country in the world that's doing the greatest amount of surveillance, and it's very advanced. They know ever such a lot about their population, and you know, over time we'll be able to track exactly who knows what, where, how well, precisely what they're doing with it, etc. It's not a way we want to go, obviously. I think we need to look at that and learn how not to go about it, but also to learn the power that data can bring with it. I think we need to look at a much more conservative way forward. Now, the US is very good at investing in AI in education in a way that we are not. Now, we are good at AI in the UK. We're certainly, you know, in the top 5 in terms of sophisticated understanding, science, development of AI systems. So I think the US is good in terms of the amount it invests in it. But I think there are other countries, much smaller countries, in Scandinavia and in parts of Eastern Europe, where they are taking a step back and really thinking about how to help everybody get an understanding of AI. I loved the Finnish 1% project. Let's help 1% of the population to understand AI. And then they can help another 1% to understand AI. If that had been here, we probably would have gone, oh, let's have 69% of the population understand AI. Completely impossible. 1% so achievable.
Yeah, I would say I've just returned for a visit to Australia, and they've got an organisation.
Good example, yeah.
They've just set up a federal organisation, the Australian Education for Research, and that's. I think they're doing some interesting things.
Yeah,
you know, they're a federal group. They can look across the states. They've got a bit of a bigger remit. And they've also got links with other government departments, and I think it's like, you know, having that conversation with other, it's not just an education issue, thinking about it in other areas. And so I think they're doing some interesting things and thinking about this in some interesting ways too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen. Just a final question from me. I'm intrigued. Your company is called No More Marking, Ms. Christodoulou.
Right.
Final.
Go on.
Why is it called No More Marking?
Because in assessment terms, the technical assessment meaning of marking is applying a number to a piece of work. And what we do, and does not involve AI, what we do is we use an approach called comparative judgment. It's human judgment, but it's human comparative judgment, that the human will read the writing, but instead of applying a mark to one piece of writing, they will read 2 pieces, comparative judgment, and they will say which is the better piece of writing, and they make a series of decisions like that. So at no stage are they ever applying a mark to a piece of writing, but then when all the decisions are crunched together, all of the pieces of writing will be allocated marks.
You've satisfied my curiosity admirably. Can I thank our witnesses, Professor Luckett and Ms. Christodoulou. That was a fascinating session, and you've exposed a lot of the debates that we have in here, so we're very grateful. Can I, and apologies for being 10 minutes late, invite our next panel of witnesses to join us at the table. And I'm pleased to introduce them. They are Dr. Matthew Glanville. Dr. Glanville is the Head of Assessment Principles and Practice at the International Baccalaureate, the IB, which provides education programs to nearly 2 million students worldwide. And Dr. Glanville is a former maths teacher, joined the IB in 2014. Prior to that, had held roles at Ofqual, the Qualifications, Exams and Assessments regulator, and he has a PhD in mathematics. Welcome, Dr. Glanville. And Joel Kenyon. Mr. Kenyon is a science teacher and is the community cohesion lead at Dormers Wells High School in Southall, in London. He has a website, In Question, which covers content related to but outside the national curriculum to help enrich lessons. Very grateful to both of you for coming today. Perhaps I could just start with a very brief question to Dr. Glanville. Given the publication of the white paper today that places its emphasis on existing regulators rather than a new regulator, as someone that was formerly in Ofqual, does that seem sensible to you, or would you, does your experience lead you to favour another direction, in other words, a specialist regulator?
I think it's really important that people who have a fundamental understanding of education then look at what artificial intelligence means in that context rather than the other way round. So I'm definitely in favour of the existing expert regulators feeding into how it works well in education.
Thank you, that's very clear and very helpful. Perhaps I can start with a question to Mr. Kenyon, and thank you for taking time away from your students today. I hope they'll forgive our claim on you. But we're all very interested to know how you as a teacher use AI in your classroom with your students.
In particular with research, with making resources. That's mainly how I use it, because the largest part of education and teaching and stuff, a lot of time is made in making them resources. So I've just tried to find ways in where I can shorten the time that it takes me to make something. So sometimes I know what I want to make and I know how I want to make it, but it's getting that first step. And so, for example, with a waggle, so what a good one looks like, or a wabble, what a bad one looks like, which would be an answer to an essay question. And then from that essay question, it would generate an answer, and then they would critique it, say this was what's good about it, this is what's bad about it. I can also make it put in spelling mistakes, so it'll put 5 spelling mistakes in there, and then the pupils have to go through and highlight the spelling mistakes.
You use the word wabble.
Yeah.
that is, I'm very familiar to you, but not, I'm afraid, to me and perhaps some other members. So just
what a bad one looks like.
What a bad one looks like.
Yeah, so it's an essay that is not very good. So then the pupils then have to critique what is good about it. And the ChatGPT is actually really good at making a bad version of something. And it can also make a really good version of something that then the kids can then
that's a waggle, is it?
That's a waggle, yeah.
What a good one. Waggle and a waggle. I see. Okay, well, that's an important piece of learning that we've made. So you apply that. Now, do you do it, is this a kind of personal thing? Do you do it, does your school do it in a structured way? How does it
we centralise our lessons in science, where all the different topics were divvied out, and then we were all responsible for the topics that we made, and then all of them resources are made as a department, and we share them all. So when I was making mine and ChatGPT came onto the scene, I just went, maybe I can use this. And then I used it to make mine. So some of my resources for Key Stage 3, and then the personal ones that I have for Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, I've made them personally. It's not necessarily something the school is using, but it is something that individual teachers are using in order to speed up a process.
I see. And you've got this In Question website. Is that sort of promoting what you're doing in your practice more widely, or making it available more widely?
It's just making it available and highlighting it. So it's a practice called Hinterland, which is the stuff that's not on the curriculum that can sometimes make the curriculum a little bit more interesting. So just stories from a wide range of fields that are just a little addition, a little add-on that can sometimes make a subject that's quite dull or not that interesting to people, just make it a little bit more interesting. So then I've written some articles on there that wouldn't potentially be interesting for another teacher to use, and then mention in the classroom and apply context or real world applications to some of the science that we talk about. And then I also go through how you can use it in a lesson as well.
I see. Okay, that's very helpful. Perhaps I could just ask a question to Dr. Glanville before I turn to my colleagues. So the IB hit the headlines a few weeks ago in making a statement that you won't ban, the organisation won't ban the use of tools like ChatGPT for the IB exam. Could you just explain the rationale, explain what that means in practice and why you've come to that decision?
Excellent. So the IB's approach is that students who use passages of text or other things generated by artificial intelligence must reference that in the same way as they would reference any other material they've taken from a different source. And that means that they need to put it in quotation marks, say after the part, this is what I've used, this is where it's come from, and then include it in the bibliography, what system they used, and also what prompt they used to generate it. And the principle here is that we're trying to make sure that students are transparent about what is the own work that they've produced and what they have referred back from somewhere else, whether it's an artificial intelligence system or whether it's from another source altogether. This was, say, published on the 27th, and then on the 16th of March, we followed that up with a new academic integrity policy, which sets out a whole annex dedicated to the use of artificial intelligence in this context.
I see. So, and this is for assignments that are outside the exam room,
Yes.
assume.
This is really for the coursework elements that were spoken about earlier. Obviously, with exams themselves, the students wouldn't have access to the technology to do this, but we do have coursework that counts towards the final grade.
I understand. So, so your requirement is that if AI is used, then you have to kind of reference it and cite it. We heard you probably, you were sitting for the previous session, you'll have heard that it's very difficult to detect whether it has indeed been used. So what is your thought process around detecting things where people haven't made the citation that you say you require?
This is where the IB approach to that coursework is really helpful, because we've always required that teachers are alongside the students during the process of writing their coursework. So they need to have meetings with them as they're starting to think about what the coursework is, and then working with them during it, looking at early drafts to the final place. And in that context, teachers are able to recognise when suddenly a whole pile of work that the student hadn't previously even thought about appears, and can have those conversations with the student about where did that come from, what does that mean. And this is actually exactly the same approach we use with essays brought off the internet, that teachers can recognise when suddenly a student goes from having no understanding to some understanding.
And are they required? Do you have kind of rules that they sign up to undertake to spot that and intervene?
Yes, we have clear instructions on how teachers should support students during their coursework, and teachers are expected to sign a declaration that, to the best of their knowledge, this is the student's own work. And that, again, has been in place for multiple years in the IB.
And what has been your experience of, as it were, policing that? Obviously, there's pressure on schools, there's on students to get good exam results. How have you found that you often have to, as it were, kind of audit the performance of teachers in this and the practice of teachers in this?
What we found is that teachers are very good at spotting where there's a step change in their students' learning that seems odd, and very, very much so being able to say, yeah, there's something odd going on here. We have on occasions needed to be very supportive of our teachers, saying that is a clear responsibility, because obviously parents and students can put a lot of pressure onto teachers to say, well, go on, look the other way. But we're lucky that we've got a very committed group of teachers who are prepared to stand up and say, actually, no, it isn't, and the IB can then step in to support the teachers and the schools when they say these things.
But do you kind of sample particular scripts or contributions
Yes.
and interrogate them and go back and look at the history of the teacher's intervention?
Yes, we do both of those. When we have our school inspection visits, that's part of what we look at, and also we've taken a sample of old coursework anyway and review it and interrogate it. Now, That is a very powerful tool with plagiarism, but as the previous witnesses said, we don't think that's going to be the right tool to use for for checking this sort of artificial intelligence, because it's not going to be able to detect it in the same way as a high quality essay, mill essay can't be detected because it's a unique piece of work. And we don't know the student anything like the teachers know students. So that's where the best opportunity for identifying this comes from.
I see. I should just ask Mr. Kennedy, I mean, do you teach the IB in your school?
No,
so it's GCSEs and A-levels.
Yeah.
And is there an opportunity for people to use AI tools like ChatGPT in coursework for the exams that you teach?
So I specifically teach science, so it doesn't have, we're 100% exams, but then there is in year 12 the CPAC element, which is the practicals that we do, so where they all have to produce a write-up. So there is an opportunity for them to therefore use AI in order to answer their questions or to write an entire report about an experiment that they've done. However, I don't actually think it poses that much of an issue, because these exams, these CPACs have been done hundreds of times by hundreds of different students, and there are a wealth of resources already online that the kids can already copy and paste and slightly edit slightly. So they can use AI to help them answer their question, but it will probably just be easier for them to use a resource that's already been made. So what I do as a teacher, and what a lot of us do is when we look at the CPAC write-ups, is we say, did they do this in the practical session? Is the data that they got in the practical session? Are the conclusions ones that we've spoken about, or ones that that would pop up? Do they fit where they are in the curriculum? Because are they mentioning stuff that's in topic 6 or 7, in topic 4? So we take all of that information in when we look at the work that they've given us.
It's a similar process. There is strong personal teacher kind of scrutiny of what is being submitted.
So when we talk about the dystopian opportunities where the kids look at a screen, etc., the problem with that with AI is, in order for us to detect whether a pupil has cheated or used AI when they're giving coursework, for example, the only way that we're actually really good at doing that is the relationships that we have with the pupils over time and the understanding of where they are in the curriculum. So if you took out the human element, then that makes it impossible to detect whether a pupil has cheated. So therefore, a human element is needed, because it's the only way that we could figure out whether a pupil has used an AI or not.
I see. Okay, that's very interesting. There's a brief supplementary from Erin Bell, then I'm going to go to Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Chair. Just to you, Dr. Glanville, I appreciate the difficulty you're in, obviously, with ChatGPT and all of this, but if your method so far is basically, well, the pupil has obviously advanced far beyond what we'd expect, or they've done it too quickly, surely a ChatGPT can produce an essay in the style of the previous essays of that student. I mean, that's just a matter of laziness rather than trying to get a better grade. I mean, is there not a real fundamental concern for continuous assessment and coursework that we heard in the first session, that it's just not going to be possible once people start using these tools in a, in quotes, smart way?
I'd absolutely agree with you that there's a real challenge, and as my colleague here has indicated, I do think the teachers are able to understand what their students are capable of doing. And I think it's a very interesting question that if they're using artificial intelligence to create what they could have created themselves, does that then become an assessment issue, or does that then become a behavioural issue, because they'll get the same outcome? More generally, yes, I think it raises some really challenging questions about how we do assessment outside of a tightly controlled. But I personally believe, and the IB, I think the IB believes, that there are some skills that really aren't best assessed in an exam context. And that's the problem there. What is it we value? You got a flavour of that earlier. What is it we think is important, and what's the best way to assess that? And it may well be that some of those we can't do meaningfully in an exam context, and therefore it's better to assess them in the best situations we can get rather than not assess them in a more secure system. And that's the tension that we deal with every single day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Stephen Metcalfe, then Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. I'd be interested to know, based on your experience, how many students do you think, firstly, are aware that AI is available to help them, secondly, are using it, and how do we keep track of that, I suppose, is the third part?
Right. The third part is the bit that I think would require actively going out there and doing high quality research, which isn't being done at the moment. My impression is that we've been talking a lot with our teachers through multiple different routes, seminars, planned conversations to explain, webinars about how assessment works, conferences, and probably because of the statement, most of our teachers are now aware and starting to think about it, and they're giving us feedback that their students are also aware of sort of artificial intelligence. So I think in the short term there will be a lot of students who understand and know about it. I think the challenge we've got is how do we turn that knowledge into ethical and safe use rather than using it in sort of shortcuts, which has been described earlier.
Yeah, but that's just within the IB sphere.
That's just within the IB sphere. I haven't had contact with teachers outside the IB.
Would you care to speculate, or should we ask Joel if he has
any
insights?
I think I'm going to have to pass that impossible question to you two. You don't know either.
It's kind of one of them. I don't think you'll ever know. I don't think you'll ever know the number of pupils that are using it. They are using it. There's no two ways about it. Some of them will say that they use it, or will say that they've looked at it or made it try to do something, but they'll never, I don't think they'll ever admit to saying, oh, I used this to make this essay, because that's just not going to happen. So therefore, trying to collect data on trying to find out how many people are using it isn't even impossible, because it's just a questionnaire and you could just tick no, I don't know, I can use it.
But so from just your sort of local personal experience, students you're interacting with are aware of its existence and they're using it. You possibly,
so
but you don't really know in what ways. And
no, so in terms of that homework and stuff, we use an online system called Educate that does our homework for us, and I know a lot of other departments do that as well. But in ones where we're asking them to do essays and stuff like that, then in English, for example, I can imagine it's going to be quite difficult for them to get anything useful out of their the feedback, giving feedback for their homework, because we do not know if they've used a system or not. So it would be really difficult to get that.
This isn't, I mean, in the area that I was going to question about, but just in terms of this explosion of AI, and obviously it's now turning into a sort of an arms race or a battle between you as educators and teachers and big tech giants, you know, helping students combat you. It sounds like some sort of bizarre video game. Do you think there is any responsibility on the tech companies themselves to potentially embed data within, so you can't just copy and paste an essay you've written, and actually it's not feasible? You'd have to retype it, in which case you might have learned something.
I think I'd like to rephrase your initial premise not to be a battle between artificial intelligence is going to become part of our everyday lives. I think that question of do we get dystopian, do we get a beautiful future is important. And what we really need to do is to make sure that we support our students in understanding what ethical and what useful approaches are. I do think that I would be grateful to the tech companies if they could do more to try and embed things, but I'm also realistic that that's not a silver bullet that'll address all of it. There will be other systems that don't have that set up, so even if the big ones act responsibly, there'll be others that still pose the same challenge. So let's address the real issue and not try and fight against something that's going to become part of, I think, everyday life in the not too distant future.
I am just going to echo that one. It's going to happen. You could regulate it and say that you can't put in large volumes of text and ask them to do it, but there will be another one using a VPN to access in a foreign country that doesn't have that regulation in place, and they will just be able to use it. You could ask certain companies to limit the amount of information it can give in or how much it can output, but again, there will be another company that will just not do that. You have got the big ones like OpenAI, Google have just released Bard. They are the big ones, but it's the smaller ones that you will near on find impossible to regulate. So instead of trying to fix it with regulation, try to look at what is the outcome and how we work with them outcomes rather than trying to overarchingly change everything.
Okay, it's very helpful, thank you. So I suppose what that highlights is that this is a powerful tool, it's here to stay. AI is actually, we interact with AI every single day of our lives now, on our phones and decisions made on our behalf. some of those decisions are very serious, some of them are not. And so therefore we judge the risk associated with individual artificial intelligences. Where would you place AI in education on that sliding scale of risk? Is this something we've really, is it a big issue that we've got to get our heads around, or is this just an interesting sideshow that teachers, educators will work out how to deal with?
I think because I believe that it's going to become part of our everyday lives, it's a really important thing, because otherwise we're going to end up with an education system that prepares students for yesterday's issues, not tomorrow's issues. And that's not true of artificial intelligence, that's true of all of us. So I think it's something we really should be thinking about right now. And so it's quite high up that list. Where I am not less concerned, but I think that with working with our teachers, it doesn't need to be the showstopper to assessment. It presents some real challenges, or make us really rethink how we assess and what we assess, and that's a really important thing. But I think really about understanding the impact it's going to make on the world. So how do we need to teach our students to work within this new paradigm? That's what's really important here, and that's a big challenge that we need to address sooner rather than later.
Where we're talking about AI changing the face of education, I don't necessarily believe it's going to be a massive silver bullet. Will have massive ramifications for how we teach. I agree with Daisy from before. Education will probably just look the same. I don't think it will make large changes. But one of the things that we do need to look at is again the same issue that was raised before. Where is it getting its information from? So if you're a pupil who is being asked to critically evaluate something, and you want your little starting base, which is what a lot of people use ChatGPT for, where's my starting point, and it puts you at a starting point with a heavy bias, then that changes the entire way that you write the rest of your essay. And we do need to know where they're getting their information from. ChatGPT, for example, where it gave you your false profile, is using data that's 2 years old. Google's is using data that is immediately on the internet, and we already know the level of misinformation on the internet already. And the problem is that people using this AI in the classroom, or using this AI to answer questions from a homework, for example, it may inadvertently introduce them to their misconceptions and their biases.
Okay. But in terms of the risk to people's education, to students' education, is the emergence of these technologies, is it, so just in your view, is it low risk, medium risk, high risk? Something that could be managed or...
So for my subject in particular, I think it's relatively low risk, mainly because of the things that I teach, and the way it's assessed. So because it's assessed in an exam, they haven't got access to any of this, and then the assessments that I do in lesson and the questioning I do in lesson, they don't have access to them either. I imagine in subjects where they use coursework based, will be significantly more impacted. So for my subject, I think it's relatively low, but in ones with coursework, I can imagine it's relatively high.
Brilliant. And final... Matthew,
I think I would agree with a great deal of what's said there. It is going to have a far bigger impact in some of the coursework areas. It's not a new challenge. We've always had the essay mills and everything else, but what it does do is bring it to a far larger part of the community. I think it is, I'd probably put it in the medium risk category.
Excellent. Thank you. Both answers to the exam question.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Rebecca Long-Bailey, then Tracy Crouch.
Thank you. We've spent quite a lot of time discussing the challenges of AI in education, but what guidance or support would you like to see from the government and regulators on the use of AI in education? Starting with Matthew.
I think, the IB obviously is an international organisation, and therefore we believe that we've actually got that obligation to support our teachers and our students in understanding that. And whilst I would be delighted to understand what the feedback from the government is and the ideas from government and regulators Ofqual, we also need to be doing that internationally so we get the best possible thing. I do think it's really important we get information from somewhere to our teachers and our students soon. And the feedback I'm getting from a lot of our teachers is what's working well. We've heard about this. How should we use it in our classrooms? How can you share with us good examples? And the IB is trying to do that. We have a system called IB Exchange where teachers can exchange ideas about what they're going on, and artificial intelligence has been a big part of that in recent years. But I think we really need to be taking the good examples we've got and sharing those, and sooner rather than later.
And are there any particular countries, obviously you work internationally, where you think they've got the support and regulation right on this so far?
I don't think there's any particular country around the world which we're using as our benchmark. A lot of countries are thinking about this. A lot of countries having some very sensible ideas about it. And it's about taking all of those together and bringing them into one place.
Thank you. And Joel, the initial question to you, what regulation and support would you like to see from government?
So it's mainly advice. So and signposted as to what you can actually use it for. I don't think it can be regulated away, and I think if you can regulate it so much that it will be unregulatable and it just won't work in practice. In terms of for teachers, the government do make their teacher workload surveys and the teacher workload guidance. I do think that the AI should be part of the teacher workload guidance in a way that that people can use it in order to reduce the level of workload. And in terms for students, just highlighting to them the issues. So, for example, we have the JCQ who regulate exams and how the exams happen, and they use all of the information they get from the different exam boards. Maybe we should use that information to say, well, when you're looking at coursework-based, these are the things that you should look out for. Could the government work with organisations to maybe make a better plagiarism checker? That may or may not be impossible, but I think the guidance needs to be how can you use it to reduce your workload, and what are the ways that we should understand how pupils are using it, so to signpost the issues and how to deal with them issues, and best practice when speaking with other educators to try and find out how to limit the impact it has in schools.
Thank you. And are there any specific skills that you think students might need in the future in education as a result of AI's growth? What sort of things should educators be trying to teach their students at this time?
So I have a particular issue when we talk about the new skills for the future type thing, because all of the skills that have developed in the future were not taught in schools. I do think it's a baseline foundational knowledge that needs to be focused on. Do I think AI forms a baseline fundamental knowledge? No. It's a tool, it's not a piece of knowledge. I don't necessarily believe that the kids need to know how it works or what it does, because they can figure that out quite quickly. They don't know how a calculator works, but they can use a calculator. I don't think this needs to be anything prescribed on the curriculum. I don't necessarily believe it should be anything taught, or it just needs to be mentioned in lessons as a tool that you can use if you wish to use it. Because the pupils are going to use it, but maybe we need to think about how is the best way that then pupils can use it, and that's how it should be fed in. It should just be used as, when we mention calculators, this is a tool that you can use. It is incredibly powerful, but it is a tool that you can use to make your life easier, or to make writing something a little bit easier. But do I think it should be taught? No, not really.
The really important one here is understanding of bias. Yeah. The difference between getting something up on Google and getting it up with an artificial intelligence engine is it sounds very authoritative, and it's not. And all the previous conversations about the bias, the inherent issues around what source material it learned from to produce this, that's the real bit that I think is absolutely critical. And then that feeds into the principles of being able to understand and listen to other people's arguments and appreciate there are different points of view, all of which is absolutely critical to an education, obviously part of what my organisation strongly believes. So that's the real big key one for me. They need to learn not to take it at face value, but to interrogate it, to think about it, to look at it. And those are skills that they should apply to any piece of information they get from anywhere else. So it's not a new skill, but it's just so much more important now because there isn't any filter to it, and that's something they need to be aware of.
Can I just add into that? Again, they do need to be aware of this, but it's just now a new additional one that they need to be aware of, because we've been using the internet for years. Pupils have been using them, and they need to learn that bias from the websites that they get their information from. And this is just another one of them things that we as teachers need to teach pupils to understand bias. This is just another one of them things that we add into that mix.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. Tracy Crouch and then Dawn Butler.
Follow on from the bias aspect, that's a two-way process, though, isn't it, from teachers and students? I mean, we're just having a conversation about the bitterness that some of us still feel decades on from our friends copying essays days before the internet exists and getting better grades than us because they had always got better grades than us. So how do you as teachers also sort of kind of respond to the bias that might have been generated in what's being given to you? In terms of you'll have your own sort of kind of bias towards what a student is presenting, because that student's always given something that's good. So how do you remove that to sense check whether it's been AI generated or not?
Okay, I think what you're talking about there is how do we make sure that teachers aren't biased and don't stereotype students. If that's the case, you're absolutely right. That's one of the real key skills of being a good teacher, to be able to recognise your own personal biases and the baggage you bring to a situation and then work to remove it. And that's part of teacher training. I mean, that's a long way from conversations about artificial intelligence, but it's absolutely critical that if you've got teachers who bring their bias and impose their views on their students, we need to deal with that with teacher training, no matter whether it's IB teacher training or UK or anywhere else. I think you'll be better placed to respond, I suspect.
So I don't necessarily be better placed, but in terms of we all have a bias. The bias is there. Teachers have a bias, and when we do our training, we're taught how to try to eliminate that bias, or try to be the devil's advocate in near every situation. So when the pupils talk about, like, for example, creationism, when I teach evolution, do I have a bias? Of course I have a bias. And people who are religious would have a bias. So what we do is we then form an argument between the two. We look at the pros and the cons from both situations, and then we discuss that at the classroom so they understand the biases. And it's just a skill that teachers have. And when you mention about the copying the essay from the other person, if I was to have a student that just appeared in my lesson one day and they gave me an essay and it was made with ChatGPT, it would probably get a good mark, and I probably wouldn't suspect it. But what we do as teachers is we for some cases, we're with them for years. So for year 12 students and year 13 students, sometimes we've seen them over 7 years. And we meet them multiple times, and we have all of other teachers in the same department who understand them pupils as well. And what we have in the classroom is we have conversations where we go, you had them in year 11, is this the type of work that you'd expect from them? And then it's a yes or a no. And then when it's a no, that's seemingly come out of nowhere, there's been a massive jump in just a year, then that's when we look at it and we go, where did you get this information from? Is this plagiarised from someone? Have you got it from somewhere? And they're just the conversations that we need to have. And you say about when they copy off you, like change the word and stuff like that. Again, we're really good at noticing. We can always tell when they follow the same theme or there's the same understanding. Teachers are taught and teachers understand that kids are going to do it, so you need to learn how to spot it.
Well, I mean, what I'm sort of kind of trying to suggest is, like, say Dawn is an A-grade student, doesn't surprise me,
Well done.
and I'm a C-grade student, which wouldn't surprise any of my previous teachers. We've both used AI to come up with very similar essays. Okay? Dawn's is considered A-grade because Dawn's has always been A-grade. But mine, despite the fact that we've used exactly the same level of AI to generate the same answers in the same format, you're saying that I would also get an A because Dawn's got an A, or would you sort of kind of suggest that even though we've used the same tools, that I would still get my C? And I think that's the challenge for teachers.
Is you can test a pupil's understanding by what question they ask. So, did you ask ChatGPT the right question? Did you ask the AI the right question? And it would be the difference in the level of knowledge between you two, for example, where the outcome would be different. The output from the AI would be different based on the information that you give it to begin with. And then maybe that A-grade student would be able to notice where it's a little bit too advanced, or it's mentioning something that I don't know, and therefore able to edit it. Whereas the C-grade student may say, I'll say C-grade, where they may not be able to go, that's too advanced for me, because they don't know where the level of advance stops because they're not there yet. There is a bias, of course there is, where you've been getting A's all of the time. I want to give you another A. You've been getting C's all of the time. Maybe you've just made a good essay. But it's a conversation. I'm not just going to give you it back with no feedback and blank it off. I'll say this is a good essay, but I am also concerned as to where you've got your information from. So in a cold cut scenario where we mark it and give it them and that's it, then yes, that can happen. But we mark with conversations and feedback to help build the students' understanding as to why they've got that mark. And then also we then find out whether or not you've cheated.
I think this is putting additional pressure on the teaching profession as a consequence of that, in terms of fact-checking and everything else.
It will do. And if that is one thing that the government does need some guidance on, is how do we do it in the best way possible that doesn't increase the amount of workload. I do think it doesn't that much now, but I do think it will in the future.
Sorry, I will let you come back in, Matthew, but I just wanted to give you an example, actually, of the new Google AI function. I don't know why, but a friend put into it, is Tracy Crouch a good person? And you would please know that they can't make moral judgments for themselves. But rather interestingly, it says she has also been criticised for her support of fixed odds betting terminals. Which is the complete opposite, given I've resigned from government over fixed odds betting terminals. Now, that means that actually this AI, you talked about misinformation on the internet, has actually gone onto the wrong piece of information. Now, you as a teacher, say for whatever reason, you were asking your class to do an essay on me, you now have to go back and check that.
This is where subject knowledge is incredibly important. So I know my curriculum. There'll be parts of my curriculum that I don't know as well as others, but I know my curriculum and teachers know their curriculum. And as time goes on, when you start, you don't know that much of it. You only know what you've got from your degree. And then as you've been teaching it for a few years, you start to learn more, and then you find out what their misconceptions are. So again, that's a test of subject knowledge. If I was a politics teacher who was just talking about you, for example, then I would, if I was teaching you and what you'd been doing, then I'd know and I'd read and I'd understand before I taught it. So then I'd instantly be able to pick up the misconception. If I'm teaching science, for example, and I ask them structure of the earth and they mix up all of the order, I can instantly figure out that they've missed up all of the order because I have good subject knowledge. And I think that's one thing that is important in order to help combat this AI. Teachers need good subject knowledge, and that again is part of the teacher standards, but I do think it does need to be emphasised a little bit more.
Just before Dr. Lanville answers Tracy's point, I mean has a very important implication that you need to have teachers with specialist subject knowledge, and as part of our diversity in STEM inquiry, one of the things we established is that in STEM subjects there is a shortage of qualified teachers. So that adds to what's already been a problem. I mean, you're a STEM teacher. Would you agree with that?
There's two problems to do with this aspect. So you have teachers who are leaving the profession in a short period of time, which means they haven't gained the subject knowledge, and then they're replaced by a teacher at the very beginning of their career, which again, they then need to generate their subject knowledge. And then the second part of the problem is how is this disseminated down and what does it look like for the future? Because teacher recruitment is not doing very well, ITT recruitment is not doing very well, initial teacher training is just not doing very well. And if we end up with teachers who are teaching non-specialist subjects, then it makes situations like that more able to happen.
I see. Thank you. Sorry, Tracy.
Sorry, and also, sorry, Matthew.
That's absolutely fine. The point I wanted to come in is right back to your initial premise here, that the two of you had produced a piece of work of the same standard. Now, part of my job and all the checks and balances I put in place are to make sure that you would receive the same credit for the quality of that answer. So you wouldn't get a lower mark than your colleague because of teacher expectations or anything like that. We would need to do everything to make sure that we had the same issue. What it might throw up is that when I'm looking for anomalies that highlight things that look out of place, a piece of work where you've done much better than you usually do probably is something that justifies greater investigation, because the outcome of you using ChatGPT has been something outside the expectations, and then we have to be very careful to make sure that we don't oversell that. So this is again why I think it's so difficult to spot where ChatGPT is going, because simply the fact that you've done really well isn't indication of you've done anything other than working very hard on this piece of work. And the level of expertise I need to be confident comes from, again, talking to a teacher who's taught you and can then do that great investigation. So there is a potential challenge here to say, yes, you'll get challenged on it more likely because it looks out of the order, but not that you would get a different outcome.
Just one last question. Joel, you clearly embraced AI, particularly in terms of processes and everything else. Do you think that there is any aspects of teaching where you do not think AI should be used?
Anything pastoral. So when I was looking through where shouldn't you put AI, pastoral was just an instant one. The care that we give to pupils, the small conversations that we have with them when we build them relationships, that it just shouldn't come anywhere close. So, for example, if a pupil has came to a head of year, and I'm thinking in the dystopian, if they came to the head of year with an issue and they go on and they type in their issue and they get how to fix said issue and advice for that issue, you're missing the personal connection, and the pupils therefore then don't form social, they don't learn make social connections, they don't learn empathy as well. They need to learn all these things through a human. That there's no two ways about it. You can't learn empathy from a computer. And I think that's one thing that if you were to regulate anything, it shouldn't touch pastoral, because it needs to highlight the importance of the human connection between a teacher or the support staff and the student themselves. And if you were to introduce AI into that, you end up with pupils who may end up in the future, in this dystopian future, being cold, with no empathy, and just mimic a computer. So I think if all of the different aspects, pastoral needs to be the one that we just make sure AI does not touch.
And I presume you agree as well.
I absolutely agree with that. I thought the previous point about levels of risk is something that is really challenging, and where you have a huge impact on a student of a decision, that's where I start being very nervous about using artificial intelligence to make that judgment. For example, I think also in the case of academic integrity, it may be a wonderful tool to get evidence, but it's probably not the tool that we'd want to use to make that final judgment. I also thought Rose's previous comment about the difference between teaching and tutoring is a really valuable one, because at the moment I think there's a lot more that a teacher can bring than just the evidence that the artificial intelligence can generate for the teacher.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We turn now to Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for my A's, Tracy. Just picking up on something you said in regards to, I think Joel, you said in regards to children maybe mimicking computers. I had read actually that in primary school the teachers were having problems with children who were just telling them to do things because they were used to talking to their Alexa, and so there was no please or thank you. It was just because that, and and it was very straight and quite harsh, and so they had to kind of unlearn that from them if they want something done. But I also think, do you think that we need to focus on teaching a lot more critical thinking in schools now? Because if young people are going to have to decide, they're going to get some information from AI, in order for them to understand that might not be right or correct, then they're going to need to learn critical thinking skills, right? Do you agree, Matthew?
Absolutely, and this isn't a change in the IB philosophy. We've always focused on teaching those critical thinking skills, for example, through our theory of knowledge course, and it's critical thinking together with recognising that there are different forms of the truth and why different people hold it, and all of that stuff. It's not new, it's always been important, but with artificial intelligence I think it becomes even more important and even more urgent that people understand that.
Right, thank you, Joe.
So I have two different perspectives. One is I don't believe you can just teach critical thinking. You can't make a curriculum on critical thinking. I think that's near on impossible to do. But what I do in science is we have our ethical questions that we have in science. We have discussions to do with evolution and creationism, alternative like Big Bang theory versus steady state theory. All of these different types of conversations that happen that makes them develop the critical thinking. Maybe an emphasis could be made on how that critical thinking comes out in different topics. But I don't necessarily believe that you can teach critical thinking as a concrete one, this is the curriculum for critical thinking. I think it forms a part of the curriculum now, and I do think that we as teachers do teach critical thinking. Could it be done more? Yes, I do believe it could. And should AI now sort of be brought into it, where let's say an AI is making a decision, should that decision be taken by the AI or by a human? Yes, these are now new conversations that we can have, but the critical thinking is taught. We teach it all of the time. Maybe we should make more of an emphasis on how that the critical thinking is done and why we're thinking them ways. I do think there needs to be more of a focus on that. But I do personally think that we teach critical thinking. We just need to put more of a focus on it.
Yeah.
Personally.
Great, thank you. Because I think that's also going to help to people to identify the biases that's in the system,
Exactly.
isn't it? Can I ask you if there's a difference between your vision of where you see AI in education in 10 years and what you think the reality might be? So what would you like in regards to AI in the next 10 years, and what do you think will happen?
So what I would like to happen is for the situation to remain quite similar, but it just becomes a new tool that we can use, and especially to do with feedback. So if I've got a classroom of 26, 27 or 30 pupils, in some extreme cases, not in my school, but in certain schools around the country where they're pushing 30 to 33, it's impossible to give the level of feedback that we would like. So in my ideal scenario, when a pupil has answered a set of questions, the way that they've answered them questions could give feedback on how to improve, or maybe with their tick box questions tells them a topic that they should revise. Ideally, that's what I think it should go to. But in reality, I think it would appear as a fad that people then start using. A few things appear, and then the ones that stick stay, and then the rest of them just fizzle away. And this is the thing, in about 10 years' time, there'll be programs that teachers can use, but they won't necessarily be the best programs that we want. I do think it should be something that is made in collaboration with government and with teachers and educators, that what do we want to get out of it? We want to reduce teacher workload, we want to make sure pupils get good feedback, and we want to make sure that assessment works. It's just, if we left it open in a vacuum, I don't think that would happen at all. I think it needs to be curated by teachers and government as well.
The reverse of kind of what's happening now, almost.
Well, if you were to go on the media, on Twitter, for example, you'd think that AI was taken over, and I don't necessarily believe it is. I just think it's being used more as a tool, and we need to work with them tools. Again, we could end up into the dystopia. I don't think that's happening. I don't think no one wants the dystopia to happen. So there are programs now that we use that will. So I'm also an examiner for AQA, that we don't look at the tick boxes. The computer does that for us. That is quite a basic AI, but that is a reducing of workload and making processes easier. We are already using it. We just need to use that type of thing more. I don't necessarily think it's the opposite of what's happening now, because it is happening now, because it's used when marking exams, and it's used in giving feedback for certain websites. I do think it's bringing it more into the classroom and doing it a little bit more often.
Thank you. Matthew.
I think artificial intelligence will be used more and more behind the scenes of organisations like my own, with the other exam boards, to do a lot of good stuff there, whether it's checking, whether it's understanding how things fit together. Where my fear is that we won't see the changes of society properly reflected in where we teach our students, and therefore this dystopian future where people don't critically think about statements enough. We're already seeing that in some of the social media posts. We're already seeing that in some of the fake news debates. And I think the use of artificial intelligence, again, unless it's trained on the right, and who am I to define what the right information source is, we're going to find that snowballing, and I fear if we don't get ahead of the curve with teaching students how to use this software appropriately, we may suddenly find ourselves in a very dangerous position. So it's exactly back to your first point. Understand the bias in there, understand the critical thinking, understand the critical reading. That's what we need. And it's not critical thinking by itself. You've got to have a knowledge base to be able to learn how to think critically, but in many ways it's knowledge-based independent, so it doesn't matter if you learn it in this subject or that subject. You need to be able to take that across all of the subjects, and that's what makes, I think, a really good education system. It's not about teaching people to be great biologists, it's about teaching people to be really great learners and thinkers, and that's where we need to get to.
Thank you. And last question, Josh.
Can I just add in? It's just, I think what's important to think of is, what do you want your education system to be? Do you want your education system to be you pass this exam, you do well? Or is your education one that benefits the whole of society? The reason why we have our education system now is to level a playing field, so every single person has the access to their future that they want. In the past, it was limited. It was based on the money that you had or the connections that you had. The reason we have our education system now is we give every single pupil in the entire country the same resources, the same knowledge, the same information in order for them to do whatever it is that they want in the future. If we make it where education is you learn this for X, then we severely limit the impact that education can actually have on wider society. Education is for everyone, and it is to make sure that we have an educated population that can make the right decisions, that can put people into power that make the right decisions for them. That's what education is for. It's not a tick box exercise. It's about building a bigger picture, and we talk about critical thinking and critical learning. That type of thing builds a good society, and that's what we need to make sure that education focuses on.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although there is a lot of teaching to the test that goes on in schools. Yeah. But my last question, if you can make one suggestion to government as it considers the future of AI in education specifically, what would it be?
I can't resist responding to your previous comment. I'm sorry, you just hit one of my... Teaching to the test does happen. And so what's an obligation on me as an assessment person is to make sure that the test is assessing what's really important. So by teaching to it, we're also teaching students what is really important. So, yeah, again, backwash effect from the assessment is so important. I think that's what I would also say to all education organisations and people thinking about education. Let's make sure we are assessing what is important, and that's what is important. Perhaps artificial intelligence will change a little bit, not categorically, but it will change what we need students to have coming out of education. Let's assess that.
Thank you.
One thing. So if I was to say anything to the government, it is try to think of a way of implementing AI that doesn't necessarily have a detrimental effect, and publishing guidance and advice on how schools and how organisations and companies outside of education can use AI for the better, by speaking with people in the field, by speaking with experts to do with AI, publishing advice and guidance, to publish advice and guidance on how to use it in the most effective way, and keep it out of certain areas. Do not use it in X, Y or Z, for example, with pastoral.
Thank you both very much. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you both very much. Thank you for giving evidence today. It's been fantastic to hear from practitioners. You've really helped us, as did the previous witnesses, develop an understanding of some of the complex implications of AI for education. We're very grateful for that. We'll return you to your classroom and to your students, Mr. Kenyon.
I'm sure they've missed me.
At least they get to see you on telly.
Oh yeah, they will.
Absolutely. That concludes this meeting of the committee. Order.